You ever do something incredible for your family, something so big, so life-changing, that you think for once they might actually see you, actually appreciate everything you've done, only for them to turn around and stab you in the back like it meant absolutely nothing? That's exactly what happened to me, and let me tell you, I still remember the exact moment I realized that no matter how much I gave, no matter how much I sacrificed, no matter how much I tried to earn their respect, I was never going to be anything more than a convenient option to them, something useful to take advantage of until they found a better deal. I had been saving for years, working long hours, skipping vacations, cutting back on things I wanted so I could finally do something meaningful for my parents, something that would make up for all the years they struggled, for all the times they talked about how they wished they could retire in peace without worrying about bills or mortgages hanging over their heads. They had spent their entire lives working, scraping by, never really having much to call their own, and I wanted to change that, wanted to give them something that would make them feel secure, something that would let them breathe easy for once. So I bought them a house. Not just any house. Not some run-down fixer-upper that needed years of repairs or a tiny place on the edge of town that barely had enough space to move around in. No, I bought them a beautiful, fully paid-off house in the neighborhood they had always dreamed about, the kind of place they used to point out on Sunday drives, sighing wistfully as they imagined what it would be like to live somewhere like that. It had a big kitchen for my mom, a quiet backyard where my dad could sit and drink his coffee in the mornings, a cozy guest room they could turn into anything they wanted. It was perfect, and when I handed them the keys, when I told them it was theirs, no strings attached, the look on their faces made every single sacrifice worth it. For the first time in years, I felt like the favorite son, the one they were actually proud of, the one who had finally done something that mattered to them. My mother cried, clutching my hands as she kept repeating that she couldn't believe it, that she didn't deserve something this nice, that she didn't even know how to thank me. My father, usually a man of few words, just nodded slowly. His eyes glassy. His lips pressed tightly together as if he was fighting the emotions threatening to break through. For that brief moment, I actually thought I had done something that would bring us closer, that maybe, just maybe, this was the thing that would finally make them see me as more than just the dependable one, the responsible one, the one they could always count on but never really valued the way they did my younger brother, Jake. And then Jake arrived. I should have known the second he walked through the front door. His eyes scanning the place like he was already picturing himself there, like he was already deciding where his things would go, that something was off. He gave me that same lazy grin he always had, that smug little smirk that never failed to make my stomach twist with frustration, the one that told me he wasn't impressed, wasn't grateful.
Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
Wasn't even remotely interested in the fact that I had just done something huge for our parents. Not bad, he said, wandering through the living room, running his fingers over the brand new furniture like he was inspecting it, like he was already making himself at home. A little smaller than I expected, but hey, I guess it'll do. I laughed, thinking he was just being an ass like usual, brushing it off the way I always did, the way I had done my entire life, because Jake had always been the golden child, the one who could do no wrong, the one our parents always made excuses for no matter how badly he screwed up. He had never held down a real job for more than a few months, never paid a single bill on time, never took responsibility for anything, but somehow he was always the one they worried about, the one they coddled, the one they took care of while I was left to fend for myself. At first, it was just little things. Subtle changes in the way my parents acted whenever he was around. Small moments that I probably wouldn't have noticed if I hadn't spent my entire life being second place in my own family. My mother started talking about how Jake had been struggling lately, how things hadn't been working out for him, how he just needed a little help getting back on his feet. My father started making offhand comments about how the house had plenty of space, how it would be nice for Jake to have a place to stay while he figured things out, how it wasn't a big deal since family takes care of family. I tried not to let it bother me, told myself that I was overthinking it, that there was no way my parents would actually let him move in when this house was supposed to be for them, when this was supposed to be their fresh start. But then, one night, they sat me down in the living room, their expressions carefully neutral, their voices softer than usual, like they were trying to ease me into something I wasn't going to like. "Honey," my mother started, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes darting to my father as if she needed reassurance before she continued. "We've been thinking a lot about the house, and we really appreciate everything you've done for us, but we think it might be best if Jake stays here instead." I blinked, not sure if I had heard her correctly, not sure if this was some kind of sick joke, some kind of twisted misunderstanding that I just wasn't grasping yet. "What?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended, my heart pounding hard in my chest. My father exhaled, rubbing his temples like this conversation was as exhausting for him as it was for me. "Jake needs it more than we do," he said simply. his tone carrying that finality that told me they had already made up their minds, that there was nothing I could say that would change it. "We're doing fine, but your brother, he's had a rough time. This could really help him get his life together." I stared at them, feeling something crack inside me, something I had spent my entire life holding together with sheer willpower, something that had been built from years of being overlooked, ignored, set aside for someone they deemed more important. I looked over at Jake, who was leaning against the doorway with that same smirk, that same infuriating expression that told me he had seen this coming long before I had, that he had known all along that no matter what I did, no matter how much I gave, no matter how hard I tried to prove myself, he would always win in the end. I swallowed hard, forcing my voice to stay steady even though I could feel the anger bubbling up beneath the surface, threatening to break through. "So, what are you saying?" I asked, my fingers digging into my palms. "You want me to just leave?" My mother looked away, guilt flashing across her face for only a second before she nodded. "We think it's for the best," she said softly, like that made it better, like that made it hurt less. Jake just shrugged, stepping forward and clapping a hand on my shoulder like we were old friends, like he wasn't stealing everything from me without a second thought. "Hey man," he said, grinning. "It's not personal." And in that moment I realized something that changed everything. It wasn't personal to him, but it was very personal to me. I sat in my car outside the house that I had bought with my own money, staring at the front door, unable to bring myself to step inside because I knew that the moment I did, the moment I crossed that threshold, it would no longer feel like my parents' home, it would feel like Jake's. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white, my breath coming out in slow, measured exhales as I tried to process what had just happened, as I tried to make sense of the fact that my own family had looked me in the eye, thanked me for buying them a house, then turned around and told me to get out because my useless, entitled brother needed it more. I shouldn't have been surprised, not really, because this was how it had always been, how it had always played out from the time we were kids up until now, and I had been too stupid, too desperate for their approval, too willing to believe that if I just worked hard enough, if I just kept proving myself, they would finally see me as more than just the responsible one, the dependable one, the one who didn't need anything because he could handle himself. Jake had never handled himself, had never once taken responsibility for a single thing in his entire life, had never had to because there was always someone, our parents, their friends, an unlucky girlfriend, or even me, waiting to clean up his mess. I leaned my head against the seat, closing my eyes for a moment as memories flooded back. Memories of a childhood where I had learned that hard work and achievement meant nothing if you weren't the favorite, where I had been forced to watch as my parents rewarded failure over and over again. I had spent hours studying for every test, pushing myself through sleepless nights to get straight A's, while Jake barely passed his classes, skipping homework and partying instead of studying. And yet I was the one who got a simple "good job, son," while Jake was showered with praise just for not failing. I had worked my first job at 16, bagging groceries after school, saving up every paycheck, while Jake had wrecked his car, the one my parents bought for him, 3 months after getting his license, and instead of punishing him, instead of making him face the consequences, they had taken out a loan and bought him another one. I had spent years grinding my way through college, paying for everything myself, taking extra shifts, living off instant noodles and black coffee, while Jake dropped out of community college after one semester, blaming bad professors and unfair expectations. And somehow, someway, he had still ended up living rent-free in their house while I was struggling to keep my head above water. And now, I had just handed them a life-changing gift, something most parents would have been eternally grateful for, something that should have solidified my place in their hearts as the son they could finally appreciate. And instead of gratitude, instead of respect, instead of even a shred of decency, they had chosen him. The buzzing of my phone snapped me out of my thoughts, and I glanced at the screen to see Ryan's name flashing across it. I sighed, debating whether or not I even had the energy for this conversation, but in the end I picked up because Ryan was the only person in my life who had ever told me the truth about my family, the only one who had seen through their bullshit long before I ever did. "So," he said the moment I answered, his voice already laced with suspicion. "How did it go?" I let out a humorless laugh, shaking my head as I stared up at the house, watching as a light flicked on in what used to be the guest bedroom, my room. "Take a wild guess," I muttered, rubbing my temple as a dull headache began to form. Ryan let out a long sigh, the kind that told me he already knew exactly what had happened before I even said it. "Let me guess," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "They were so grateful, so touched, so unbelievably moved by your generosity, that they decided to hand it over to Jake because poor, helpless little Jake needs it more than you do." I clenched my jaw, gripping the phone tighter. "Nailed it." There was a pause, followed by a sharp exhale then. "Daniel, what the hell is wrong with you?" I blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me." You heard me, he snapped, and I could picture him pacing in his apartment, frustration radiating off him in waves. Why do you keep doing this to yourself? Why do you keep giving them everything when they've done nothing but treat you like an afterthought your entire damn life? I swallowed hard, my throat tightening, because as much as I wanted to argue, as much as I wanted to come up with some kind of defense, I had nothing. 'Cause he was right. Ryan sighed again, this time softer, more measured. Listen, man. You need to fight back. You need to stop letting them walk all over you like this. I let out a bitter chuckle, shaking my head. And do what, Ryan? Drag them to court. Kick my own parents out of the house I bought for them. Ryan didn't answer immediately, and for a second I thought maybe I had shut him up. Maybe I had made a point that even he couldn't argue against. But then his voice came through the speaker, calm and steady. Maybe you should. I froze, my heart skipping a beat, my grip on the phone tightening. What? Maybe it's time they learned what it feels like to be treated like they treat you, he said simply. Maybe it's time for you to stop playing the good son and start playing the smart one. I opened my mouth about to respond, but then I heard laughter from inside the house. Jake's laughter, loud, obnoxious, filled with the kind of smugness that made my skin crawl. I looked up just in time to see a group of people stepping inside. Music blaring, bottles of alcohol in their hands, laughter spilling out into the night like some kind of sick joke. Jake was throwing a housewarming party. In the house I bought. The switch flipped inside me so fast that I barely recognized the feeling as my blood turned cold, my jaw tightening, my hands clenching into fists at my sides. It wasn't just that he had taken what wasn't his, it wasn't just that my parents had let him, it was that he was standing there, in the middle of my generosity, mocking me with it, treating it like it had always belonged to him, like I had never even been part of the equation. I was still standing there, watching, frozen in place, when I heard my parents' voices floating through the open window, their words clear as day over the music. I know Daniel worked hard for this, my mother was saying, her voice hushed but still carrying across the room. But Jake deserves this more than he ever did. Something inside me broke. And for the first time in my life, I finally understood exactly what I had to do. I didn't argue, didn't yell, didn't throw a fit, even though every nerve in my body was screaming at me to do something, to lash out, to demand answers, to make them feel the same level of betrayal that was currently clawing its way up my throat like bile. Instead, I did something that none of them expected. I left. I turned around, walked out of the house that I had bought with my own hard-earned money, stepped off the porch without a single backward glance, and got into my car with hands that trembled just slightly from the sheer force of holding everything inside. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white, my breath coming in slow, measured exhales as I forced myself to keep it together, forced myself not to let them see me break, not to let them have the satisfaction of knowing that they had finally pushed me too far. As I pulled out of the driveway, I caught a glimpse of them through the living room window. Jake lounging on the couch, a beer in hand, my parents standing beside him, smiling, laughing, looking as comfortable as if nothing had changed, as if nothing was wrong, as if they hadn't just stabbed their own son in the back without a second thought. I saw my mother reach out to ruffle Jake's hair, saw my father nod in approval as Jake stretched, settling in like he had always belonged there, like I had never been part of the picture to begin with. And that was when I knew they thought they had won. They thought I was done, thought I would disappear quietly like I always had. Thought that I would just accept it like I had accepted every other unfair thing they had thrown at me over the years. They thought that because I wasn't screaming, because I wasn't throwing things, because I wasn't making a scene, it meant that I was weak, that I was helpless, that I had no choice but to swallow the betrayal and move on like I always did. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. The moment I got home, I went straight to my desk, yanked open the bottom drawer, and pulled out the one document that mattered more than anything else right now, the house deed. I ran my fingers over the embossed paper, my heartbeat finally slowing as I let the reality of what I was holding settle into my bones, as I let the first wave of calm wash over me. Because while they might have taken my place in that house, while they might have made it clear that I wasn't welcome there anymore, there was one thing they hadn't counted on, one detail they had been too short-sighted to consider. They didn't own the house. I did. They could redecorate, they could move their things in, they could make themselves as comfortable as they wanted, but at the end of the day, they were living in a house that legally belonged to me, in a home that was still under my name, on property that I had paid for with my own money, and that single, undeniable fact changed everything. I sat down at my computer, my fingers moving quickly as I began to make calls, send emails, reach out to people who could help me figure out exactly how to play this the right way. I wasn't going to act on emotion, wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing me lash out, wasn't going to let my anger control my actions the way Jake always had. No, I was going to be smart, going to be careful, going to make sure that when I took back what was mine, there wouldn't be a single thing they could do to stop it. The first call I made was to a real estate lawyer, someone who specialized in property disputes, someone who could tell me exactly what my rights were, exactly what legal steps I could take to ensure that this played out in my favor. The conversation was brief but eye-opening, and by the time I hung up, I was feeling something I hadn't felt in hours: relief. Because it turned out my parents had made one massive mistake, one fatal miscalculation that they hadn't even realized at the time. They had never asked me to transfer the house to their name. In their rush to take what they thought they were entitled to, they had assumed that because I had gifted them the house, because I had handed them the keys, because I had moved in with them after the purchase, it meant that they had full control over it. But legally, they had nothing. They weren't on the deed, weren't listed as co-owners, had never signed a single piece of paperwork that gave them any claim over the property, which meant that at any given moment I could take it all back. I leaned back in my chair, a slow smirk spreading across my face as I stared at the document in front of me, as I imagined the look on Jake's face when he realized that the house he had so confidently taken from me was about to be ripped right out from under him. I imagined my mother's frantic voice, my father's stunned silence, the absolute shock and devastation that would hit them the second they realized that they had made a terrible mistake in underestimating me. They thought I was helpless. They thought I would roll over and accept it. They thought I wouldn't fight back. But they were about to learn just how wrong they were. I reached for my phone again, my heart pounding with anticipation as I dialed the next number, my voice calm, collected, completely in control when the person on the other end picked up. "Yes, hello," I said smoothly, my fingers tapping against the desk as I leaned forward, already picturing exactly how this was going to play out. "I need to file an eviction notice." I could almost hear Jake's cocky laughter echoing in the back of my mind, could almost see the smug expression he had worn when he patted my shoulder, when he told me it wasn't personal, when he acted like he had already won. But this time I was the one who was going to win. The eviction notice arrived on a bright, ordinary morning, landing in their mailbox like an unexpected storm, a neatly folded envelope carrying within it the weight of a decision that they never thought I would make. My parents had probably woken up that day the same way they had every morning since forcing me out of the house I bought for them. Comfortable, complacent, completely unaware that the world they had so carelessly built on the back of my generosity was about to crumble beneath their feet. I imagined my mother humming to herself in the kitchen, making coffee the way she always did, setting out breakfast for Jake like he was still a child who needed to be taken care of instead of a grown man who had spent his entire life taking and never giving anything back. I imagined my father reading the newspaper, sipping his coffee, completely convinced that everything was exactly as it should be, completely at peace with the fact that they had chosen my brother over me without a second thought. And then I imagined the exact moment my father walked outside to check the mail, the exact second his fingers brushed against the official-looking envelope, the slow unfolding of the paper, the way his eyes must have scanned the words once, twice, 3 times before it hit him all at once, the cold, hard, undeniable truth staring him in the face. They were being evicted. The panic must have spread through the house like a virus, infecting every corner, turning the easy morning into a frantic mess of voices rising, hands shaking, confusion and anger colliding as they tried to process how this had happened, how things had spiraled out of their control so quickly, how their perfect little setup had suddenly transformed into a nightmare they couldn't escape from. My mother would have gasped, her hand flying to her chest, her voice breaking as she read over the notice, her fingers gripping the paper so tightly that the edges would have crumpled under the pressure. My father would have stormed back inside, his face turning red, his breathing sharp and uneven, already reaching for his phone, dialing my number with trembling hands, knowing before I even picked up that I wouldn't answer. And Jake. I imagined him standing there, his smug confidence fading into something else, something ugly and desperate. His mind racing as he realized that the free ride was over, that the housewarming party had been for nothing, that everything he had taken so easily was about to be ripped away before he even had time to settle in. My phone buzzed over and over again, their names flashing on the screen, their calls coming in rapid succession, but I didn't answer, didn't even acknowledge them, just watched as the notifications piled up, each voicemail left unheard, each frantic message ignored, each desperate attempt to pull me back into their chaos met with nothing but cold, unforgiving silence. They wanted me to fix it, wanted me to undo what I had done, wanted me to be the responsible one, the dutiful son, the dependable backup plan that they had always relied on whenever things fell apart. But this time, I wasn't going to be the one to save them. I let them stew in it. Let them feel every ounce of the helplessness they had forced onto me. Let them sit in the mess they had created. Let them understand what it felt like to be cast aside, to be treated like they were disposable, to be left without a lifeline, without an escape, without a single person willing to step in and clean up the disaster for them. The messages from my mother started off soft, pleading, filled with forced sweetness and desperate reasoning, as if she could simply talk me into changing my mind, as if she could convince me that family meant forgiveness, that love meant sacrifice, that I was cruel for doing to them what they had so easily done to me. Daniel, sweetheart, please call me back. We just need to talk about this. I think there's been a misunderstanding. I think we can work something out. I think we can figure this out together because we're family, and family doesn't do things like this to each other. Family doesn't do things like this to each other. I almost laughed at the hypocrisy, almost laughed at the sheer audacity of that statement, because where was that sentiment when they had kicked me out of my own house, when they had handed my home over to Jake like it was nothing, when they had smiled and told themselves that I didn't need it, that I didn't deserve it, that my sacrifice was just another thing they were entitled to. The messages from my father came next, more aggressive, more demanding. His anger bubbling to the surface as he realized that I wasn't playing along this time, that I wasn't giving in, that I wasn't bending under the weight of his disapproval like I had always done before. Daniel, pick up the damn phone. This is ridiculous, this is childish, this is not how you handle things. I don't know what kind of point you're trying to make, but you've made it loud and clear, and now it's time to stop playing games. You're better than this, son. You're not the type to do something so petty, so vindictive. I stopped listening after that, stopped reading the messages, stopped letting their voices fill my head, because I didn't owe them an explanation, didn't owe them the satisfaction of knowing what I was thinking, didn't owe them anything at all. But Jake didn't beg. Jake didn't plead. Jake didn't try to reason with me or talk his way out of it like my parents had, because Jake had never learned how to do those things, had never needed to, had never been forced to face the consequences of his actions before now. No, Jake was furious. His messages were filled with rage, filled with entitlement and arrogance and sheer disbelief that I had actually gone through with it, that I had actually pulled the rug out from under him, that I had actually dared to take back what was mine. Are you serious right now, dude? Are you actually doing this? You can't be serious. You can't actually think you're going to get away with this. You can't actually think that mom and dad are going to let you do this to them. To me, after everything we've been through, after everything they've done for you. This is my home now. You gave it up, you walked away, you left, so what the hell is your problem? You wouldn't really do this, would you? The final message came later that night, after hours of unanswered calls, after they had exhausted every other attempt to get me to cave, after they had finally realized that I wasn't going to break this time. I was at the grocery store when it came through, standing in the checkout line, staring down at my phone as Jake's name flashed on the screen one last time. I answered not because I wanted to hear what he had to say but because I wanted him to hear the silence on my end, wanted him to understand exactly how little his words meant to me now, wanted him to feel the weight of being ignored, of being powerless, of being the one left behind for once. You wouldn't really do this, he said. His voice shaking with something I had never heard from him before, fear. I didn't say a word. I just hung up. The days that followed were filled with more phone calls, more desperate messages, more attempts to convince me that I was being unreasonable, being cruel, being someone they didn't recognize anymore. But the truth was, I had never felt more like myself than I did right then. I ignored every call, let every voicemail go unheard, deleted every text message without even reading them, because I already knew exactly what they would say, already knew that my mother would plead with me to reconsider, that my father would try to guilt-trip me into backing down, that Jake would lash out, blame everyone but himself, throw a tantrum because for the first time in his life, he wasn't getting his way. I knew that my parents weren't calling because they had suddenly realized they had done something wrong, weren't reaching out because they had truly reflected on their actions, weren't desperately trying to fix things because they had finally seen me, finally understood how much they had hurt me. No, this wasn't about regret, it was about survival. They had never expected me to fight back, had never considered the possibility that I would have the power to take back what they had stolen. Had never once imagined that the son they had treated like an afterthought would be the one to rip away the comfort and security they had so carelessly taken for granted. They thought that if they pushed hard enough I would fold, that if they cried enough I would feel guilty, that if they reminded me enough times that we were family I would give in, but they didn't seem to understand that I had already given them more than they had ever deserved, had already given them years of patience, of sacrifice, of turning the other cheek every time they chose Jake over me, every time they took without ever giving back, every time they dismissed my pain like it wasn't even real. But that was over now. I had spent my entire life believing that if I was just good enough, strong enough, successful enough, they would finally see me, finally love me the way they had always loved Jake, without hesitation, without limits, without conditions. But I finally understood now that their love had never been unconditional. It had always come with a price, always required me to shrink myself down, to accept less, to give without expecting anything in return. And I was done paying. I sat in my lawyer's office, my hands resting calmly on the polished wooden desk, my expression unreadable as I watched him scan through the paperwork. His sharp eyes flicking from one page to the next. his head nodding slightly in approval. "Everything is in order," he said finally, setting the documents down, folding his hands neatly in front of him as he looked at me. "Once we file this, they'll have 30 days to vacate the premises. If they refuse, we can escalate it to a formal eviction hearing, but given that they have no legal claim to the house, they won't have a leg to stand on." I exhaled slowly, letting the weight of those words settle in, feeling the finality of it, the absolute certainty that I was about to do something that there would be no coming back from. I knew that once this was done, there would be no more pretending, no more forced family dinners, no more empty apologies meant to keep me in my place, and I thought I might feel some sadness over that, some small pang of regret over what I was about to lose. But I felt nothing. "File it," I said, my voice steady, unwavering. "Let's get this done." By the time my parents received the formal notice, their calls had shifted from desperate pleas to full-blown panic, their voices no longer carefully controlled, no longer coated in artificial sweetness, no longer carrying the false warmth that had always been meant to manipulate me into doing what they wanted. My mother sobbed into the phone, her words barely coherent, her voice breaking as she begged me to reconsider, as she pleaded with me to just talk it out, to be reasonable, to think about what I was doing to my own family. "Daniel, please, we made a mistake. I see that now. We just got caught up in the moment. We didn't mean to hurt you. We never thought you would actually do this to us. Never thought you would go this far. Never thought you could be so what? So cruel. So cold. So much like them." Hung up. Jake's messages were nothing but rage, threats, pure, unfiltered entitlement. His words dripping with disbelief, as if he still couldn't fathom that the world didn't revolve around him, that things weren't always going to go his way, that there were consequences for the way he had treated me, the way he had taken everything from me without even a second of hesitation. "You're a pathetic, bitter piece of shit, you know that? You think this makes you strong. You think this makes you better than me. All this does is prove that you're a petty little loser who can't handle the fact that Mom and Dad actually love me more. Go ahead, take the house, take your stupid revenge, but at the end of the day, you'll still be nothing, still be alone, still be the same miserable, unloved freak you've always been." I didn't even bother responding. The night before they were set to leave, I went to the house. Not to talk, not to argue, not to make amends, but to watch. I stood outside on the sidewalk, hands in my pockets, my expression unreadable as I watched the lights flickering inside, watched the hurried movement of my parents packing up their things, watched as Jake stormed through the house, kicking over furniture, knocking things off tables, throwing a fit like a spoiled child who had just been told no for the first time in his life. And then, as I turned to leave, as I took one last look at the house that had been meant to be a symbol of love, of gratitude, of everything I had once hoped my family could be, my mother appeared in the doorway. She stood there, her eyes red, her face pale, her hands clutching at the fabric of her sweater like she was trying to hold herself together, like she was barely keeping the broken pieces of herself from falling apart completely. For a long time, neither of us spoke. And then, in a voice so soft that it almost didn't reach me, in a tone so filled with heartbreak and betrayal that it should have shattered something inside me, should have made me stop, should have made me rethink everything, she whispered the words that she must have known would be the final blow. "You're not my son anymore." I waited for the pain to hit, waited for the guilt to sink in, waited for the regret to crawl up my spine and wrap around my throat like a vice. But it never came. I just looked at her, at the woman who had given me life but had never truly known me, at the mother who had always chosen Jake first, always made excuses, always told herself that I would be fine without her love because I was the strong one, the independent one, the one who never needed anything from her. And then, without a word, without a flicker of emotion, without even a second of hesitation, I turned and walked away. The morning of the eviction was gray and cold, the kind of day where the sky seemed to press down against the earth, heavy with unspoken tension, thick with the weight of something coming to an end. I stood across the street, my hands shoved into the pockets of my jacket, watching as the reality of their situation finally crashed down around them, watching as the family who had once looked at me like I was nothing more than a convenient resource now scrambled like rats trapped in a sinking ship. The moving truck sat parked in the driveway, its back door flung open, half-packed boxes stacked haphazardly inside, a physical reminder that this was real, that this was happening, that they had lost, that they had brought this on themselves. Jake stood on the front lawn, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his expression dark with fury, his jaw clenched so tightly that I could see the muscle twitching beneath his skin. He was staring at the ground, his posture stiff, his entire body radiating resentment, anger, disbelief, as if he still couldn't process the fact that this was happening to him, as if he still thought that, somehow at the last possible moment, things would magically fall into place and save him like they always had before. But no one was coming to rescue him this time. For the first time in his life, there was no safety net, no backup plan, no parents willing to swoop in and fix everything, no easy way out, no one left to shield him from the consequences of his own arrogance. He had no job, no savings, no real-world experience, nothing to fall back on except the realization that he had spent his entire life coasting on the sacrifices of others, that he had wasted every opportunity handed to him, that he had spent years treating people like stepping stones only to find himself with nowhere left to step. My mother was crying, her hands shaking as she tried to gather up the last of their things, her voice rising in panicked, tearful gasps as she called relative after relative, friend after friend, desperately searching for someone who would take them in, someone who would offer them a place to stay, a couch to sleep on, a temporary solution to a problem that had already grown too large to fix. But no one was answering, no one was offering, no one wanted to be involved. I had heard the rumors already, had seen the way word had spread through the small, tight-knit community, how the story of what they had done had taken on a life of its own. They had kicked out their own son after he bought them a house. That was the version people knew, the version that had painted them as selfish, manipulative, ungrateful, the version that had finally made the people around them see them for what they truly were. I watched as my father paced in front of the house, his phone pressed against his ear, his voice sharp and clipped, his frustration barely contained beneath the surface of his forced politeness. He was trying to find a rental, trying to book a last-minute hotel, trying to regain control of a situation that had already spiraled far beyond his reach, but I could tell from the stiffness of his posture, from the way his fingers curled and uncurled into fists, that every attempt was met with the same answer. No vacancies, no options, nowhere to go. For once, they were the ones with no way out. Jake finally broke first, his patience snapping like a frayed wire, his voice cutting through the cold air as he turned to our parents, his eyes wild with panic, his frustration finally boiling over into something that sounded dangerously close to desperation. "This is bullshit," he shouted, his voice raw, his hands gesturing wildly toward the moving truck as if expecting it to disappear, as if expecting everything to somehow reverse itself, as if he could simply throw a tantrum and make the world bend to his will the way it always had before. "You guys were supposed to figure this out. You said we'd have somewhere to go. You said we weren't actually gonna be homeless. So where the hell are we supposed to go now?" My mother flinched at the venom in his voice, her lower lip trembling as she tried to answer, tried to find the right words to soothe him, to reassure him, to fix a situation that was already beyond repair. But for once, she had nothing to offer him, no easy lie to soften the blow, no excuse to make everything better. My father just shook his head, exhaling sharply, his fingers pinching the bridge of his nose as he tried to keep himself from exploding, tried to hold onto the last remaining scraps of his dignity in the face of complete and utter defeat. And I just stood there, watching, unmoved, unaffected, knowing that they had built this disaster with their own hands, knowing that this was exactly what they deserved, knowing that this was what it looked like when entitlement finally met the reality of consequences. They had never once considered that I would fight back, had never once imagined that I would be the one standing on the outside looking in, watching as they lost everything, watching as they finally understood what it felt like to be tossed aside, to be treated as expendable, to be left with nothing but regret and resentment. The eviction crew arrived right on schedule, 2 uniformed men stepping out of the truck, clipboards in hand, their expressions neutral, professional, completely uninterested in whatever personal drama was playing out in front of them. One of them approached my father, offering him a curt nod before motioning toward the house. His voice calm, detached, as if this was just another routine job, just another day at work. "Sir, you have until noon to vacate the premises," the man said, his tone polite but firm, leaving no room for argument, no space for negotiation, no last-minute reprieve to cling to. "If you refuse to comply, law enforcement will be contacted, and further legal action may be taken against you." I saw the exact moment the fight drained out of my father, saw the way his shoulders sagged, the way his hands fell to his sides, the way he finally accepted that there was nothing left to fight for. My mother was still crying, still shaking, still looking to him for answers, but for once, he had none to give. Jake, on the other hand, was still fuming, still unable to comprehend that this was really happening, still convinced that there had to be some way out, some loophole, some last-minute miracle that would save him from the reality of what he had done. He turned suddenly, his eyes locking onto me, his body tensing, his hands curling into fists at his sides as he took a sharp step forward, his voice dripping with venom, his entire body shaking with rage. "This isn't over," he hissed, his voice low, dangerous, filled with a hatred that would have rattled me once, that would have made me hesitate, that would have made me second-guess myself in the past. "You think you've won, but you haven't. You think this makes you better than me, but it doesn't. You think you're so damn smart, but you're gonna regret this, you're gonna wish you never did this, you're gonna... Enough, my father snapped, cutting him off sharply. His voice cold, exhausted, filled with something that almost sounded like resignation. He turned to me then, his expression unreadable, his jaw tight. His eyes dark with something I couldn't quite place. And then, just as he climbed into the moving truck, just as the last of their things were being loaded up, just as the weight of his own defeat finally settled over him, he spoke one final time. "You'll regret this, Daniel." I met his gaze without flinching, without wavering, without even a flicker of doubt. "No," I said simply, my voice steady, my expression unreadable. "I won't." The house felt different when I stepped inside, quieter than I remembered, emptier in a way that had nothing to do with furniture and everything to do with the weight that had been lifted from it, the presence that had finally been erased. I stood in the entryway for a long time, letting my fingers brush against the wall, letting the silence settle around me, letting the realization sink in that for the first time in my life, I was standing in a place that was completely mine, a place that no one could take from me, a place that wasn't tangled in guilt or expectation or the suffocating pressure of a family that had never really seen me as one of their own. The last of their things had been hauled away hours ago, leaving behind only the echoes of the people who had once lived here, the ghosts of voices that had filled the space with demands and entitlement, with manipulation disguised as love, with a heavy, cloying scent of obligation that had never been reciprocated. I took a deep breath, inhaling air that felt lighter than it had in years, and for the first time since this entire nightmare had begun, I let myself feel what it meant to be free. I walked from room to room, my footsteps slow, deliberate, my gaze scanning the space like I was seeing it for the first time, like I was unraveling the memories attached to every corner and deciding which ones were worth keeping and which ones needed to be erased. The house no longer belonged to them, no longer carried the weight of their selfishness, no longer served as a monument to their ability to take and take and take without consequence. This house was mine now, fully, completely, without apology, without guilt, without the shadow of their expectations looming over me like a storm waiting to break. I stood in the living room, staring at the empty space where their couch had been, remembering the way my father used to sit there with his coffee, never looking up from his newspaper when I walked into the room, never acknowledging me unless I had done something useful, something worthy of his fleeting attention. I let my eyes drift to the spot where my mother used to stand in the kitchen, where she would cook meals for Jake and insist that I could get my own, where she would gush about how much potential he had, how he just needed a little more time, a little more support, a little more of everything that I had never been given. And then there was Jake's room, the one they had told me to give up without hesitation, the one they had handed to him like a prize for a life spent leeching off the kindness of others, the one that had been a symbol of everything they had stolen from me. I pushed the door open, stepping inside, feeling the remnants of his presence lingering like a bad aftertaste, stale and unwanted. The walls were bare now, the closet empty, the scent of his cologne still faint in the air, and for the first time it hit me. He was really gone. No one knew where Jake had gone after the eviction, not even my parents, who had spent the first few weeks after leaving the house calling everyone they knew, grasping at any lead, any whisper of information, any hint that their golden child hadn't simply disappeared into nothingness. But no one had answers, no one had seen him, no one had heard from him, and for the first time in his life, there was no one left to clean up his mess. I had seen it coming before they did, had known that once the reality of his situation fully settled in, once he understood that he was well and truly on his own, he would run, would find somewhere else to latch onto, someone else to manipulate, someone else to carry the weight of his existence while he did nothing to earn it. I had no doubt that he would land on his feet eventually, because people like Jake always did, always found another way to avoid responsibility, always managed to charm their way into another easy setup. But wherever he was, whoever he had latched onto now, he would never be my problem again. My parents, on the other hand, had not been so lucky. I had heard bits and pieces from mutual acquaintances, whispers about how they had struggled to find a new place, how they had been forced to downgrade to a cramped rental that barely fit them, how their once pristine reputation had turned sour when word spread about how they had treated me, about how they had thrown away the son who had given them everything in favor of the one who had never lifted a finger to help them. They had burned every bridge they had ever built, had turned away the people who might have helped them, had relied too heavily on a network of social connections that had shriveled up the moment they were no longer useful. And now they were alone, isolated, bitter. Exactly like they had left me. I should have felt something about that, should have felt pity or regret or the kind of lingering sadness that always comes with losing family. But when Ryan asked me if I regretted it, if I ever wondered whether I had made a mistake, if I ever thought about reaching out, the only answer I could give him was the one that had been sitting heavy in my chest for weeks now. No, I said simply, setting my drink down on the bar top, watching the condensation drip down the side of the glass, feeling the absolute certainty of my own words settle into my bones. Not even a little. Ryan studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable, his fingers tapping lightly against the wood. His eyes scanning my face like he was searching for something, waiting to see if I would crack, if I would hesitate, if I would second-guess myself the way I always had before. But I didn't, and after a moment, he just nodded, letting out a slow breath, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Good," he said finally, raising his glass. "You deserve better than them anyway." I clinked my glass against his, taking a slow sip, letting the words settle, letting the truth of them sink in, letting myself finally believe them. And then, as I pulled into my driveway later that night, as I stepped out of my car and made my way up to the front door, I saw it. An envelope sitting on the doorstep, small and unassuming, the handwriting on the front immediately recognizable. My mother's handwriting. I stared at it for a long time, my heartbeat steady, my fingers tightening slightly at my sides, my mind already racing with possibilities, with questions, with the reality of what this meant. And then, slowly, carefully, without a single word, I bent down, picked up the envelope, and carried it inside. I sat at the kitchen table, the envelope resting in front of me like some kind of relic from a past life, something fragile, something weighted with expectation, something that had the power to pull me backward into a place I had fought so hard to escape. The handwriting was unmistakable, the delicate curves of my mother's letters, the slight smudges where her pen had hesitated, the careful way she had written my name as if that alone could soften whatever words were inside. For a long time I didn't move, didn't reach for it, didn't try to open it, just stared at it like it was a bomb waiting to go off, like the second I let myself look at what was inside, it would unravel something in me that I wasn't ready to face. I had told myself I was done, had convinced myself that I had nothing left to feel for them. No anger, no sadness, no lingering attachment, but as I sat there, staring at this last, desperate attempt to claw their way back into my life, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not regret, not hesitation, but the smallest, faintest flicker of temptation. For a moment I almost reached for it, almost let myself believe that maybe this time would be different, almost let myself fall back into the trap of thinking that they had changed, that they had learned, that they finally understood what they had done. It would have been so easy to tell myself that people could grow, that people could make mistakes and find their way back, that blood meant something, that family wasn't supposed to be this messy, this broken, this irreparable. But then, just as quickly as the thought had come, I remembered everything. I remembered the night they sat me down and told me to leave my own house, the way they had spoken to me like it was a reasonable request, like I should have been grateful to be given the opportunity to sacrifice myself for Jake's comfort. I remembered my mother's nervous hands twisting in her lap, my father's unreadable expression, Jake's smug smirk as he leaned back against the couch like he had already won. I remembered the way they had celebrated my absence, how they had laughed, how they had lived in that house as if I had never existed, as if my kindness was something they had been entitled to all along. I remembered every voicemail, every text message, every pathetic excuse they had thrown my way once they realized I wasn't coming back, once they understood that they had backed the wrong son, that they had thrown away the one person who had ever actually done something for them. I remembered standing on the sidewalk on the day of their eviction, watching them pack their things, watching the panic settle into their faces, watching the reality of what they had done finally sink in. I remembered Jake's fury, the sheer disbelief in his voice when he realized that this time, there was no getting out of it, no one to save him, no one to clean up his mess. I remembered my father's final words, the hatred in his eyes, the sharp bitterness in his voice as he told me I would regret this, as if he still thought he had some kind of power over me, as if he still thought his disapproval could break me. And most of all, I remembered the moment my mother looked me in the eye and told me that I was no longer her son. I exhaled slowly, my fingers brushing against the edge of the envelope, feeling the texture of the paper, the weight of it, the quiet desperation that I knew was inside. I could already picture what the letter would say, could already hear my mother's voice in my head, soft and pleading, carefully crafted to tug at whatever emotions she thought I still had left for her. "Daniel, please, we're struggling. Your father isn't well. We've lost everything. We never meant to hurt you, we never thought you would actually go through with it, we never realized how much we needed you until it was too late. Please just help us this one last time. Please be the son I know you are." I could see every manipulation hidden between the lines, every attempt to make me feel guilty, every word chosen carefully to place the blame on me without actually saying it outright. There would be no real apology, no actual admission of wrongdoing, no acknowledgement of everything they had done to me, just excuses, just self-pity, just another attempt to pull me back in so they wouldn't have to suffer the consequences of their own actions. I knew, without even reading it, that there would be nothing inside that letter that could make me forget, Nothing that could erase what had already been done, nothing that could undo the years of being treated like a disposable backup plan. I knew that if I opened that envelope, if I let myself read the words she had written, I would only be opening the door for them to hurt me again. So I didn't. I stood up, the chair scraping softly against the floor as I picked up the letter, my grip tightening for just a moment before I exhaled, let the last of my hesitation slip away, and tore it straight down the middle. The sound of the paper ripping was louder than I expected, sharp and final, like the snapping of a thread that had been stretched too thin for far too long. I let the pieces fall onto the table, watched as they fluttered down like meaningless scraps, watched as the last connection I had to them dissolved right in front of me. I didn't feel sad. I didn't feel guilty. I didn't feel anything at all. I turned away, walked to the door, and stood there for a moment, staring out into the night, breathing in the cool air, feeling the weight of my past finally slip from my shoulders. The house behind me was quiet, empty, mine in every way that mattered, and for the first time I understood what real freedom felt like. Somewhere, in a cramped apartment filled with regret, my parents were waiting for an answer that would never come. Somewhere, Jake was blaming the world for his own failures, refusing to acknowledge that he had done this to himself. Somewhere, the family that had once discarded me without a second thought was now the ones being left behind. And I was finally moving forward. I took one last look at the torn letter on the table, the pieces scattered and unread, the words that would never reach me, the plea that would go unanswered, and I let a small, quiet smile tug at the corner of my lips. Some gifts should never have been given in the first place. Have you ever been treated unfairly by your own family? What would you have done in Daniel's place? Let me know in the comments because trust me, this story is just getting started.